All right, so in this series, for anyone who's been following, you would know that what we're looking at is the life of Jesus. We were looking at the historical figure of Jesus Christ. So, specifically focusing in on what that sign was about that they put above his head on the cross, which was, "This is the King of the Jews." So, you know that if you've been following the series, you've heard me talk about that ad nauseum. Now, if you have been following this series, certainly from the start, you might be wondering, when on earth am I going to talk about Jesus Christ? That seems to be the only thing that I haven't spoken about so far, and I've talked an awful lot about the Old Testament and the intertestamental period and all of this other stuff. What on earth does this have to do with Jesus? But at the same time, what I'm really actually hoping is that you're starting to see the connections between what I'm talking about and the Jesus that you might be familiar with in the Gospels. So for this series, I'm kind of working on the assumption that if you're listening, you know something about Jesus. Even if you've just lived in a Western country or any country really that celebrates Christmas and Easter, you know something about, you've seen a nativity scene where you've got the baby Jesus and Mary and Joseph and camels and all this sort of lovely stuff, Jesus being born in the manger. Or if you have been, you've celebrated an Easter, and so you know about the death and the resurrection of Jesus, even if you don't necessarily believe it. Or maybe you've been to Sunday school, whatever, you know something about the gospel stories that Jesus told, a few parables. Hey, maybe you've watched The Chosen. I don't know. You know something about the life of Jesus. What I'm hoping is that what this series will do is to help paint the scenery behind that story. So stories that you're familiar with, parables, all of this, that what's going on that caused that, what is going on behind the scenes of that, who are the Romans, who are all of the different sort of casting characters of this story that you may not be familiar with. So that's what we're trying to do here. And so it's taken a long time to get there because it's a big story. It's the story of the history of ancient Israel, which is the story of how Jesus came to be declared to be the King of the Jews. So anyway, that's what we're going through all of this stuff about, and so we're going to continue that story from where we left off last week, which is a world in which the Jewish world, or a world that has become Greek. It's a world that has now been introduced to a new empire that's going to be ruling it for the next couple of centuries, and is going to have an incredibly profound impact on the world that Jesus is going to be born into, and that is the Greek Empire. So where we left off last week, we found Alexander the Great had spread this Greek empire. He created the largest empire anyone had ever known, and he really sets the benchmark now for all of the generals who are going to come after him. He has done something that nobody has ever conceived of within 10 years, and only during his 20s. He's created the biggest empire that the world had ever known at that point. He'd taken down the Persian Empire. I mean, this is the absolute, total lightweight fighter who's never even been in a fight before, going up against the heavyweight champion of the world who's dominated for years and years and taking him down seemingly with ease. So this is an absolutely incredible feat that has occurred. But it's not just a military conquest that has occurred. Normally, these empires are just very much military empires. As we saw with the Persians, they were just very happy for everybody to just carry on as they were, just to carry on as normal citizens. They don't really bring a lot of change in these empires, certainly culturally. Basically pay your tribute to the Persians, just make sure you keep the peace, and as to the rest of it, figure it out for yourself. So that's the story of most empires, and that's the story we're going to see again when we come back to the Roman Empire. But for the Greeks, it's a different story. The Greeks were a world that had developed a very sophisticated culture, and again, we talked all about this last week, and that was something of the impetus behind Alexander's conquest. It was primarily military. Don't get me wrong. Alexander wanted to prove himself as a king. He wanted his men wanted the opportunity to prove themselves, as all generals do. But there was another element to this conquest, which was the spread of Greek culture. And so we've seen that happening already, where what Alexander would do would be to build cities named after himself, specifically Alexandrias, where he would go and almost place something of a church plant, if you want to use Christian terminology, but something of a cultural plant of Greek culture. So these are cities built specifically for the purposes of building gymnasiums and Greek temples and Greek theaters, and build the most beautiful, wealthiest cities in the regions that will attract people to them. People would want to come and live in these cities because they will be the capitals of power. They're going to be the places where the seats of power are going to be. And that's going to attract people to them. And what they're going to find when they get there is these incredible Greek cities. But what they're also going to find are these opportunities to themselves be trained in Greek culture, specifically through schools. So gymnasiums are set up all over the world. And this is the place where parents can send their children to be educated. In the same way that Alexander was educated by Aristotle, you can send your children to these schools. And what that's going to do is give your children the opportunities to go and make something of themselves in this new Greek world. And so you're going to infuse your children or let them be trained in these ideas and in these philosophies. And so as they rise up to become the power holders, well, Greece holds the power. So if you want to get in good with the power holders, then you need to be Greek. You need to speak Greek. You need to understand the way that the Greeks think. And so that's exactly what these cities are designed to do. And for everyone living in this empire, that's fine. They don't have any necessary cultural heritage that is being affected by this. They don't have any anything that they're so attached to that they can't let go of. So that's perfectly fine. That's what the new world is. Then that's what we're going to become. But of course, there's a different story for the Greeks. For everything we've been talking about so far, for the Jews, everything about being Jewish is about being culturally Jewish. Judaism, being Jewish, is culturally, everything about your life is Jewish. And so anything that Alexander is bringing, any of this education and philosophy and, the Greek gods and all of these things are a challenge to that, and in some cases, anathema to everything that it means to be Jewish. So this is going to be a challenge for the Jewish people, and we're starting to see that challenge already taking place. And so what the Jewish people, and especially the diaspora Jews who are living in these cities, the challenge that these guys are facing is, how do we integrate with this so as to be able to survive in the cities that we have been established in now for generations? How do we sort of incorporate some of this or assimilate somewhat to this so that we aren't complete outcasts, but at the same time, where does the assimilation stop? How do we be in the world but not of the world? And that's a term we're probably familiar with as Christians. There's always the challenge of, we recognize that we live in a particular world and the particular cultural and religious challenges that world brings to our particular way of life and our particular faith. And so we're always being challenged with, where do we find that balance of assimilation? We need to assimilate to some degree so that we can have a job and, just have a life. But at the same time, we don't want to cross that line where we sort of leave behind our faith and our cultural heritage from Jesus in order to be so fully integrated into the world. So that's an age-old dilemma that the Jews have been facing for much longer than Christians have, because of course the Jewish faith has been around for a much longer time. So this is where we're going to start to see that challenge, and that's really going to sort of come into itself this week in what we're going to see today. Now, what we saw last week as well was the translation of the Hebrew and Aramaic scriptures into Greek. In this Greek world, the diaspora Jews, the people that have been raised now in this Greek world, they only speak Greek. That's the new lingua franca. That's the language that everybody is learning. And so for that reason, they need scriptures in their language, in the same way that we translate the Bible into any number of different languages, because we can't just say, well, everybody go and learn Koine Greek or learn, English or whatever the translation is. You've got to actually be able to translate it into your language so that you can have scripture. And so this is what the Septuagint is all about. It's this Greek translation, and this becomes the Bible of Paul. It becomes the Bible of Jesus. It is the primary translation that is now going to be used throughout, certainly right up into the time of Jesus and beyond into the apostles. So that's one of the big outcomes of this new Greek world that we find ourselves in. But another one that I mentioned last week and actually didn't get to, we sort of ran out of time, was the Pharisees. You know, one of the big things that we see happening between the Old and the New Testament is that the world of the Old Testament, the world that we find in Malachi, is so much different to the world of the New Testament. For example, you know, we go from what was at that time a Persian empire to a New Testament that is written in Greek, and there's been evidence of a Greek empire, but we've got a Roman empire. So there's all these changes that have occurred. But one of the primary changes that has occurred is the presence of these guys called Pharisees. And I'll focus in on them specifically because they are such a primary character in the story of Jesus. They're one of these people that we meet in the Gospels that just seem to turn up all over the place and seem to be a very severe challenge to Jesus. They appear to be very politically powerful people, and at the same time, they are constantly at war with Jesus, constantly challenging Jesus at the same time. So that's where I want to get to today. How did these guys come into the story? Who are they? Why did they come about? And the answer to that question is what I've been talking about, which is this challenge of Greek culture into the Jewish world is going to cause a reaction. There's going to be a tension that is at work. And what we're going to see is that eventually that comes to a head. It comes to a massive tension that blows up. And, well, this is where the story is going. So as you saw last week, Alexander dies in the year 323 BC. Now, he was at the time 32 years old, still a young man, certainly by today's standards, but still relatively young by the standards of his time. And so he died after 10 years of campaigning. We don't know why. We don't know what was the cause. It could be poisoning. It could have been malaria. It could have been any number of the battle wounds that he picked up over that 10 years. There was so much going on in this young kid's life, in this guy's life, and so much happened in 10 years that any number of these could be a combination of all of them that has ultimately brought him down. But nevertheless, he's dead, and there's no succession plan. Alexander and his army had started out just as a military campaign. Let's just go out for a year. Let's just see what we can get from these Persians. And it just kind of escalated. It went from, let's just go and get a bit of loot to we've taken down the Persian Empire, and then we've expanded beyond east, even beyond where the Persians had got to. He started to go down into India. I mean, he actually expanded further what the Persians had themselves done. So, I mean, this was just, there was no a way of planning for this. This is just something that was just so unbelievable that it occurred. And when Alexander had died, at the point when Alexander died, he just wanted to keep going. He was last thing he was thinking about is, well, who's going to take over this empire when I die? I mean, he's invincible. Nothing has killed him to this point. He's in all of Alexander's campaigning, he never lost a single battle. Never once did he lose a single battle. I mean, just remarkable what this guy had achieved. And so at the time of his death, he'd gone down into India, and his men had said, no, enough. It's been 10 years. We want to go home and see our wives. 10 years is an awful long time to be away from home. We want to go home. And so Alexander eventually sort of succumbed to their pressures, and so said, all right, we're going to go, but India, we're going to be back, right? We're going to come for you later on. But at the same time, he was thinking as well, I want to have a go at the Romans. The Roman Empire was the Roman forces were starting to make a name for themselves over in the West. He wanted to have a shot at the Romans, see what these guys are about. I mean, he's got big plans for really taking over the whole world. I mean, why not? He hasn't lost so far. He's basically a god. Why not keep going? So all that to say, when he died, there was no plans. There was no succession plan. He had a baby son that was never really going to work out anyway. Why think about the future? Why think about what's going to happen after me when I'm still very much here and doing great things? So what that meant was that when he did die, there was no idea of what to do next. And so what you get are his generals effectively going, well, what do we do? And so over a few years, eventually what might have been sort of an amicable succession plan eventually devolved into civil war. Alexander's enormous empire within a few years had been divided up amongst his generals into what was going to become this Hellenistic world. So when we think about the Greek Empire, when we think about sort of the Hellenistic world, now I say Hellenistic, and that's a term you'll sort of hear me use. The word Hellenistic, it comes from the word Hellas, which is actually the Greek word for Greece. So if you go to Greece, Greece is actually called Hellas. It's not called Greece. That's the English word for Greece. So when we talk about Hellenistic, what we're talking about is being Greek. In fact, we get a great example of this in Acts chapter 6, where you've got this contrast between two different types of Jews. So we're in Jerusalem, it's the early days of the church, and you've got all of these Jewish widows who are in Jerusalem being looked after by the church. And it makes a distinction between Hebraic Jews, so local native Hebrew-speaking Jews, and Hellenistic Jews, which are the diaspora Jews. So all of the Jews who are living out in these diaspora regions, all these Jews that have sort of scattered into these other cities, they're called Hellenistic Jews because they're raised in a Greek world. They're Greek-speaking. They're sort of the products in some degree of Greek culture. They're very much Greek, certainly much more Greek than the Hebraic Jews who've been raised in Jerusalem and around Judea and Galilee and these places. So that's a key distinction that we have. And so this Hellenistic empire that has now spread as a result of Alexander, that is now divided up amongst his generals. Now, that's a whole different story. We're not going to go into that, only to note that the two biggest sort of empires that break out of this. Now, keeping in mind geographically where Israel finds itself, where it is on the map, it's in the Middle East, and that is effectively in what was the Persian Empire. So what Alexander has conquered is the Persian Empire. On the sort of the most western part of that, as we get to the edge of the Mediterranean, that's where we find Israel. And so that whole sort of eastern part of the empire gets divided up into two parts. And so down in the south, down in Egypt, that becomes what's known as the Ptolemaic Empire. So General Ptolemy, who was one of the key generals at Alexander. Remember, the guys that he set out with, most of them are still around because it's only been 10 years. So General Ptolemy was actually a very close friend of Alexander, going all the way back to their schooling days. So he's a very important player within Alexander's inner circle. He takes Egypt, and that's a very prosperous region, okay? The Nile, and as we're going to see, that's the whole story of this period. Egypt is a very prosperous region because it's the breadbasket of the Mediterranean. The Nile provides so much grain because of its flooding and because of the very fertile soils that if you control Egypt, you really control the food supply for the Persians realized that, the Greeks, and then later on the Romans realized you've got to control Egypt. So he takes control of that region. And so the Ptolemies, they really become now what used to be the pharaohs. When Alexander took control of Egypt, he was declared to be pharaoh, right? So all these god pharaohs that we used to have back in the great days of Egypt, that now becomes Alexander. So he's declared to be a god. He's now Ra. He's also the son of Zeus. I mean, he's got all of these god characteristics about him, but he's also the king of Egypt. And so that gets transferred now to his general Ptolemy. So Ptolemy takes control of Egypt, and what he sets up is a monarchy where all of his descendants now become the rulers of Egypt. And one of probably the most famous of these Ptolemy rulers, and in fact the very last one to sit on the throne, is a lady by the name of Cleopatra. So that would certainly be a name you're familiar with. So that's down sort of in the southwest of Israel. So if you look at the map where Israel sits, if you keep going southwest, you get straight down into Egypt. But then up into the rest of what was the Persian Empire, up in the sort of west now of Israel, is the Seleucid Empire. So this is General Seleucid. He takes that region, which is sort of the bulk of the empire. So basically everything from the Mediterranean really down into India, all the way right out to what was the edges of that empire, he takes control of all that. So he has by far the largest region of control and another very prosperous, very wealthy region. The eastern part of the Mediterranean had been developed for centuries by this stage. It had empire after empire that had been building it up and causing it to become a very wealthy, very fertile, very literally the Fertile Crescent is found in there. It's an extremely prosperous region, and so it's always kind of the envy of the Greek Empire and then later on the Romans. They want to control this because if you control that, you really are controlling sort of the most civilized part of the known world at that stage. So you've got the two biggest, most powerful, wealthiest parts of the empire, or two empires, are right on sort of connect, the Ptolemies down in Egypt, and then you've got the Seleucids over to the east. They connect, and the point where they connect is in Jerusalem. Like where Jerusalem and where what was Israel is situated is actually the gate between these two empires. And so Israel really just becomes the meat in the sandwich between these two warring empires. And the thing about these empires is that they're constantly at war with each other because they see themselves as separate powers now. Yes, they're all Greek speaking. Yes, they all come from the same heritage. But like every general, like every great king, they want more. They want to have the biggest empire. They want to have the empire that's next to them. And so they're constantly at war with each other. And unfortunately, what that means is that Israel, in this case, is going to be the staging ground now for every time there's a new empire in town. And so unfortunately, this is what's going to happen. This is going to be the story of Israel, really for the next 200 years under these Ptolemies. So from about 305, so it's 323, Alexander dies. By the time all of these empires kind of settle themselves down and they sort of establish their boundaries, about 305 is when the Ptolemies are now ruling. So for the first part of this Hellenistic world, Jerusalem is ruled by the Ptolemies. So that's the Egyptian Empire down in the south. So those are the guys who are, and so probably sort of the northern part of their empire is going to be Jerusalem, is going to be Israel. So that's where they sort of fall under the power of those guys. But that all changes in 198. So about 100 years later, the Seleucids, they come in and they take that part of the sort of the northern part of the Ptolemaic Empire. So they again, it doesn't take much for the change of rule to happen in Israel because it's only really just by pushing the border, the boundary of the empire is going to change which empire Jerusalem falls under. So they now come under the Seleucid Empire, and so that's a new king. It's a completely different ruler. Everything is now sort of changed, and okay, that's all fine, and all of this is sort of normal. I mean, that's been the story of Israel for how long now? They've just been sort of buffeted between different empires. But a really key moment happens, or a really key change happens about 20 years later under the sort of the second king so they come to under the control of Antiochus III. Well, his son Antiochus IV, he now comes to the throne, and so now he's the new ruler of Israel. So it's 175. And Israel, again, has been under the rule of the Ptolemies since 198, for about 20 odd years now. 175, you've got this new king in town. So the young Antiochus IV, he's taken control. And like all of the kings before him, he wants to extend his influence. He wants to push the boundaries of his empire down into the Ptolemies. He wants to take that empire for himself. So that's all a fairly normal part of the story. But one of the things that he does is that in order to facilitate this happening, he needs resources. He needs funds to build his army. He needs to establish, and certainly to assert his authority over his regions. He needs money for that to happen. And so one of the things that he does, in fact, one of the things that all of these kings do, is that they make sure that they have people in place, people in power who are faithful to them. Remember, we talked about the way an empire works. One of the rules is keep the peace. And the way that you ensure that happens is that the person who's in charge of the different regions is somebody who's loyal to you. So you appoint people into positions of kings or into whatever the position might be, you make sure that that's your man. Well, that's also going to be true in Israel, in Jerusalem. And that position for a long time now has been held by the high priest. If you remember, the Jewish people haven't had a king for a long time. Going all the way back to the Persians, when they sent back the Jews, they didn't appoint a king. What they did was appoint the high priest. So the high priest now functioned in that same ruling leadership role as the king. So that's how the Jewish people have been used to being ruled by this stage. It's always been by the high priest. And so what Antiochus IV wants is a high priest in Jerusalem who is favorable to him. And that way he can guarantee that he's got somebody who's in his pocket, somebody who's loyal to him, and somebody who is going to keep the peace, and importantly, somebody who's going to collect the taxes. So it's 175, he's come to power, and a man by the name of Jason. Now, Jason who? Well, just Jason. That's it. Just Jason, because you don't have last names in the ancient world. So Jason, who's very likely the brother of the current high priest. So remember, the high priests have come from the Zadokites, so there's sort of an inheritance now for this high priest position that has sort of gone down the line. And so it's very likely that Jason is the brother of the current high priest. Well, he wants the job, okay? His brother's got it, but he wants it because with that comes all of the power and influence and the wealth that goes along with being the high priest. And so naturally he wants that. And in a sense, he's eligible for it because he's definitely from that bloodline. So he's got something of a claim to it. So he goes to Antiochus and he says, hey, I want to be the high priest. And Antiochus sees straight away an opportunity because this guy's going to be, if I give him the job, and particularly because he's offering me a very large bribe and quite a lot of money, well, if I've got him in place, I've got absolutely somebody who is loyal to me. And so he very happily takes the bribe. I mean, everyone wants more money, and then gives him the position and just moves aside the current high priest. And so now Jason becomes, well, the new high priest. Now, as an act of loyalty, his loyalty, now, of course, his loyalty is meant to be to the people of God. He's meant to be to the Jewish people. He's meant to be literally the intercessor between God, Yahweh, and the people. That's always been the role of the high priest. But now his loyalty is to a different king who at the same time is also a god. Remembering that these kings always understand themselves to be gods, Antiochus happens to believe himself to be Zeus. Now, Zeus, if you know from your Greek pantheon, Zeus was the father of all of the gods. He was the chief of all of the Greek gods. And so to claim to be Zeus is to claim to be the greatest of the Greek gods. So he understands himself to be Zeus as well as being Antiochus. So the loyalty now that Jason has to Antiochus is also, in a sense, to Zeus in a way, because this guy is claiming to be a god at the same time. So one of the ways that he expresses his loyalty is that he increases the Hellenization of Jerusalem. When I say Hellenization, that's that Hellenistic again. Hellenization is literally to make everything Greek, is to spread Greek culture. And this is the challenge, this is we keep talking about. The challenge that the Jewish people have is that there's this constant pressure to assimilate. That pressure is always there pushing against them. Just to exist in the city, you've got to be Greek to some extent. So there's always that pressure being put on you to be Greek. One of the jobs of the leaders is to protect you from that. That's the job of the high priest, is to protect the people and to keep them in line with Yahweh, to keep them in line with the values of Judaism. And that was always the job of the king as well. The job of the king was to exemplify Torah. This is his primary role, was to show the people how to live in a life that is pleasing to Yahweh. That's the job that these guys are supposed to be doing. And yet we have this king, this high priest, who's actively saying, no, we're going to become Greek. And with that, all of the Greek values of the Greek gods and the Greek education, Greek philosophy, and all of these ideas that the Greeks are bringing along, which are antithetical to everything about Judaism, well, no, we're going to be that now. And so he's fundamentally failing in his duty, and this is presenting an enormous challenge for the people who are wanting to be loyal to Yahweh, and yet their very leader is telling them to be otherwise. If you remember, what got them into exile in the first place? What was the thing that got them there? Was that they became like the people around them. And so God said, enough. I'm going to send you into exile. I'm going to destroy Jerusalem. And yet here we go again. And only this time our high priest is the one who is doing it. So this is as bad as it could possibly get. And it's almost as if, well, are we all going to start again? Is it all going to go back into exile and all of this is going to happen again? So then nevertheless, Jason is starting to push this. He turns Jerusalem into a Greek city-state. He makes it a Greek city. He declares it to be a Greek city-state, remembering that there's no country of Greece. Places like Athens and Corinth and Sparta and these sort of places, they are city-states. They're all Greek-speaking. They all worship the same gods, but they're city-states. They're independent nations of their own, with their own constitutions and their own laws, etc. He makes Jerusalem that. He declares it to be, number one, a Greek city-state, and he starts to build gymnasiums in the very place where you find the temple of God. The temple of God is the place where you come and encounter Yahweh. And experience him. You go there to learn about what it means to be Jewish. And then right next to the temple, he's building a gymnasium, a place where you go and learn about Greek gods, where you go and learn about Greek philosophy and everything antithetical to Yahweh. He starts to build theaters that are performing Greek plays and Greek ideas. But, think about, the Christian sort of the struggle with secular movies and, where do we draw the line when it comes to secular movies? Well, that's the challenge they had with the theater. And so he's building theaters in Jerusalem. And more than that, he's bringing into Jerusalem athletic events, athletic contests. Now, the Greek world expresses itself largely through athletic events. It's a demonstration of their Greekness. It's a demonstration of their superiority as human beings. Everybody runs and competes in the nude to show off how spectacular their bodies are because of their training and their great education. I mean, the very word gymnasium, we talked about it, the Greek word gymnasium, gymnos, means naked. The gymnasium literally means naked. It's the naked place because when you go to get educated, particularly out in the track and field and out in the athletics, you do it in the nude. So in the middle of Jerusalem, in a very conservative place, in a place that doesn't, within Judaism, that doesn't like people walking around in the nude, now they're hosting these athletic carnivals, and Jewish boys who've just been educated in the Greek gymnasium are going over to compete in the nude. I mean, they're just becoming Greeks. Worse, perhaps even than that, is that some of the Jewish men who are recognizing that, hey, this is becoming a Greek world, and not necessarily committed to their Judaism. It's kind of like, it's kind of like the Christian that goes to church on Christmas and Easter, maybe a little bit more committed than that perhaps, but they're certainly more concerned about their place in their society than they necessarily are in the kingdom of heaven. These guys are going, well, if we want to engage with this new Greek world, if we want to endear ourselves to the power brokers, to the Greeks who are sort of ruling over us, then we need to maybe dial down the Jewishness. And so they're having this procedure called epispasm. We talked about this already, this idea of reversing your circumcision. I don't want to describe how that is because I don't know how they do that, particularly in a time before anesthetic. But nevertheless, this is what these guys are doing in order to be seen to be more Greek. And so they're actually reversing their Jewishness in order to fit into Jerusalem. I mean, just think about that. It's just as bad as it could possibly get to become more comfortable in Jerusalem, the heartland of Yahweh. You have to become less like a Jew. Well, anyway, so this accelerates. This Hellenization accelerates as a result of what's going on, particularly under the leadership of Jason. Fast forward now to 171 BC. A new guy wants to be high priest as well. Now, this is probably another brother. We don't know for sure. We know that Jason was the brother of the current high priest. This new guy, we're not sure, but the assumption would be if he's going to have any credibility to have this position, he must have also been a relative. So very likely this is another brother who wants to be the high priest, the guy by the name of Menelaus. So he goes to Antiochus and he says, hey, I want to be the high priest. And so, just to sort of demonstrate his seriousness, he offers a bribe, a much wealthier bribe than what Jason had first offered. And so for his act of piety, quote unquote, he gets the gig. He gets to become now the high priest. And so Jason is out and now Menelaus, his brother, is in. So we have a new high priest, and who's even more loyal, you would imagine, to Antiochus, and, well, who's certainly not going to dial back the Hellenism. He's certainly not going to change any of that, because now he's the puppet in charge of Jerusalem, and, well, his loyalty is first and foremost to Antiochus, to the guy who gave him the position in the first place. Well, anyway, all of that brings us to the key part of the story, which is that Antiochus, he wants to spread his empire, and that the next logical place is to go down into Egypt. And so he needs money, he needs an army. And so with the help of this high priest who is loyal to him and not to Yahweh, with the help of the high priest, he goes and gets the wealth out of the temple. So Menelaus, the high priest, the protector of the temple, he is the CEO of the temple, goes into that temple, takes all of the money that's devoted to Yahweh and all of the treasure devoted to Yahweh, and he gives it to this guy, Antiochus. He gives it to a king who at the same time believes himself to be Zeus. Now you can imagine the just shock of everything that this entails. But of course, there's nothing they can do about that because the high priest, and he's got the backing of the Greek Empire. Well, anyway, he gives all of this wealth to Antiochus, who then proceeds to march down into Egypt to make war with the Ptolemies. Well, anyway, the Ptolemies, they call on the Romans. The Romans are going to come into the story next week, but the Romans at this point are becoming a new force. They have been for a long time, and by this point, in sort of 170 BC, they are really the primary force now, and they are the rising superpower within the Mediterranean. So every time the Greeks get into a skirmish, or every time they need help, they call on the Romans. And that's exactly what happens here. The Ptolemies call on the Romans, and the Romans don't send an army. They don't need to send an army because everyone knows what the Roman army is about. What they send instead is a senator. There's one old man named Gaius Popilius Laenas. Now, he's an old man, just an old senator sent from Rome on behalf of Rome, but what he represents is the power of Rome. He's like the ambassador of a very powerful nation that if you touch me, you're touching everything that I represent, and everything I represent is going to come and destroy you if you lay a hand on me. So no one's going to touch this guy. So he turns up and he stands in front of Antiochus's army and he says, all right, look, you've got a choice. If you, and what he does is he takes his spear and he draws a circle around Antiochus. And he says, before you step out of this circle, you need to give me an answer. Are you going to invade and in doing so make war with Rome? Or are you going to turn around and go home? Now, Antiochus obviously has a decision to make. He doesn't want to make war with Rome. He wants to make war with the Ptolemies, but certainly not with Rome and the Ptolemies. And at the same time, he's got his army behind him and he's a god. Right? I mean, he's a god king. He's literally Zeus manifest. In fact, he calls himself Antiochus IV, but the title that he gives himself is Epiphanes, literally the manifestation of God. And so he is the manifestation of Zeus. He is Zeus on earth. And so he's got that going on behind him. He's got his men that are sort of waiting to see what the God King is going to do. Well, eventually he realizes, hey, this is not a battle I want to face. And so he turns around and he goes home. But meanwhile, back in Jerusalem, something has been happening back there as well. A rumor has been spread back in Jerusalem that Antiochus is actually being killed. Now, of course, this is not true, but this is what the rumor has sort of spread. And as a result of that, Jason, our old mate Jason, the first high priest who bought his way into the job, goes along and he ousts Menelaus. Well, Menelaus, your guy, your man, Antiochus, he's dead, so no one's here to protect you anymore. So he drives him out and he retakes the high priest. And then so Menelaus goes down to Antiochus, who's still very much alive, and he tells him what's happened back in Jerusalem. Well, now this is just, if you're a god king, this is about as bad as it's going to get. You've just been humiliated in front of your whole army by one old man, and now you find out that your person back in Jerusalem, he's been kicked out by some other guy. This is just a bad day. So he goes back to Jerusalem, and he's ticked off. He's absolutely just ready for absolute revenge. And so in response, first of all, he reinstates Menelaus, and to really reassert his authority over the Jewish people, he kills many of the Jews that are living there, breaks down their wall. So the wall that's there to protect the city, breaks all of that down, basically just leaves them exposed, and they've got obviously no protection anymore. But really importantly, and this is the key thing that he does, is that he bans religious practice. So he bans circumcision. Remember what all of these things symbolize. This is what it means to be Jewish: circumcision, Torah, Sabbath, kosher, everything, and certainly the temple. These are the key things that make you Jewish. He bans all of them. Bans circumcision, bans Torah. So, boys that have been born 8 days old, they're supposed to be circumcised. Nope, not allowed to do that anymore. Bans Sabbath. Everything that makes them Jewish, all of that has been taken away. So you are in Jerusalem. You've already faced the challenge of being Hellenized, but at the very least, you can still be Jewish. You don't have to embrace the Hellenism. There's pressure to, but you can still ostensibly be Jewish in Jerusalem, but now you can't. Now it's illegal to be Jewish. This is a ban on being you. But even more than that, by removing Judaism, he replaces it now with worship of the Greek gods. You must now worship Greek gods. You are no longer allowed to worship Yahweh. And just to reinforce the point, here's what we're going to do. We're going to put a statue of Zeus into the temple. So that Holy of Holies, where there is no statue, there's no God, because there is no image that can contain our God. Well, we're going to put a statue of Zeus in there, who, don't forget, is also me, right? King Antiochus. I'm also God manifest. And then what we're going to do is we're going to make a sacrifice to that, and we're going to sacrifice a pig. Now, I don't need to explain to you the absolutely devastating how bad that is for the Jewish people, that a pig is now being sacrificed on God's altar to God's temple, in which there is a statue of Zeus. This is as bad as it could possibly get. This is the absolute worst. And, well, there's nothing we can do about it because, well, this is the Greek Empire. But what Antiochus doesn't bank on is that this is actually going to push the people too far. This is just a bridge too far. And so what begins to emerge out of this is a revolt, is a response now to this pressure that's been put on to the absolute desecration of the temple. That's crossed the line. And so what happens in response is that a group of Jewish, effectively guerrilla fighters emerge and start to fight back now against the Greek forces that are in the area. And they start to drive out this Greek influence, and this movement is led particularly by a guy by the name of Judas Maccabeus. So Judas Maccabeus, the family itself is the Hashmonean family, which becomes important in a moment. He and his brothers, he and sort of his followers, they kind of emerge to start to fight back against this Greek Empire. And what's most amazing about it is that they succeed. Their tactics are not standard military tactics of form an army and two armies go to battle and fight. No, they're never going to win that war because the Greeks are just too good at this. What they do instead is they start to engage in guerrilla warfare. They start to engage in sabotage and all of the things, all of that sort of sneaky sort of combat. On a military amount, I can't describe it to you in great detail. But what they do is that they fight the best way, the only way that they know how to fight. And over the next 3 years, they actually succeed. They actually manage to drive out the Greeks, certainly out of Jerusalem, so much so that they can reclaim Jerusalem back for themselves. So needless to say, this is an absolutely momentous occasion. We've taken back Jerusalem, and as their first act of having taken it back, they need to reconsecrate the temple. They need to cleanse it from all of this filth that has been going on for all of these years now. And so what they do is they have to go into the temple. They first of all get rid of this ridiculous statue to Zeus and just reconsecrate the temple that back to something of what it was. Now, the custom to do that was to burn oil. So you need to burn holy oil for 8 days as a part of the consecration process. But unfortunately, they just didn't have enough oil ready. They weren't, they would normally have oil sort of getting prepared for these sorts of events. They just didn't have enough. They really only had enough for about 1 day. Well, anyway, as the story goes, they started to burn this oil, and by a miracle, it kept burning for a full 8 days. And so this became such a momentous occasion, such an incredible point in Israel's history, in the Jewish history, that it still gets celebrated today. December 25th, when this event originally occurred, is now celebrated every year as Hanukkah, or the Festival of Lights, where for 8 days you burned the menorah candle as a celebration of this time when Judas Maccabeus and his brother and all of these freedom fighters liberated the people from this captivity. So this is huge. This is an absolutely extraordinary change that's taken place in Israel for the Jewish people. And they've taken back Jerusalem, but they're not going to stop there because there's still an entire Greek world around them. Jerusalem is only a very small place. They need to ensure that they are protected, that they have, well, ideally, get their territory back. If you remember, this is the whole point of what we've been doing this whole time, is to get our territory back. We want to get it back to the way it was, the land that God had promised to us in the first place. And so what they start to do is to expand out from Jerusalem and expand now this Jewish land further and further as far as they can possibly get. And so this Hasmonean empire, this Hasmonean period, becomes a period of expansion. Over the next 100 years, they continue to expand further and further out. And in some parts, places like Idumea is one of the surrounding regions, which is sort of a Jewish area, but it's also very much sort of inhabited and influenced by local sort of Arabic culture as well. They expand into those regions, and in some parts, like Idumea, they basically force conversion. If you're going to live in this region now, you have to become Jewish. And it's at this particular point that one man by the name of Antigonus, he sees the writing on the wall, he sees where the power is, and he says, okay, I'm going to become Jewish. Now, he has a son by the name of Herod. Now, we're going to pick up that story in much greater detail later on, but if the sort of origins of Herod the Great happen actually during this Hasmonean expansion. So anyway, this is really good news. We've got seemingly, God seems to be restoring things back to the way they should be. We've got our land back. We've got ostensibly Jewish ruling. This is pretty good. This is maybe this is what we've been waiting for this whole time. Maybe this Judas character is this Messiah figure, this savior figure that we've been waiting for, a person who's going to lead us back into the glory of being the people of God. Maybe that seems to be what's happening. But there are a couple of things that also happen which tend to sort of put paid to that assumption that maybe actually this isn't quite the fulfillment of what, at least the sort of fulfillment we were hoping for. One thing that happens is that Judas's brother Simon, ultimately, once they've kind of established themselves, they've made it very clear to the Greeks that we're taking back control. His brother Simon puts himself now into power. He takes over the high priest role certainly from Menelaus and Jason and all these other clowns that have just pushed them all into the trouble we had in the first place. He now puts himself into the place of high priest, but at the same time, he declares himself to be king. Now, this is a huge problem because if you remember when we first established a monarchy, we have a king, but we have a separate high priest because the last thing we want to have is a king who also is the only communication between the people and God. That's going to set up a tyrant. We need to separate the high priest, whose job it is, in part, is to keep the king accountable, to actually hear what Yahweh's actually saying and say to the king, hey, dude, that's wrong. And so in the same way, David sleeps with Bathsheba, it's his high priest that comes along and says, hey, man, that's really bad. So that's, you got to keep those roles separate. That was absolutely fundamental to the original constitution. But Simon says, no, I can do both. No, I can multitask. And so he turns around and says, no, I'm going to be the king and the high priest. So already we've got signs that maybe this actually isn't quite what we were expecting. But then at the same time, what also happens is this continuation of Hellenization. It's like it never stopped, right? And maybe not to be the same degree where we're putting statues of Zeus into the temple, but we're not slowing down on the Hellenization, because although the Jewish people have taken back something of a small piece of land, there's still a massive Greek empire that's all around them. They are still this tiny little cork in the ocean of what is the Greek empire. And so in order to at least somewhat keep the peace between themselves and their what could still become their overlords if they're not careful, they still engage with Hellenization. And in some ways they kind of want to, because that's where the power is. That's where the wealth and the influence is within the Hellenistic world. And so you still want to have, if you're a powerful leader, you still want to be able to engage with that. And so that doesn't really slow down. There's not a cleansing of the culture, which is to restore it back to being a fully Jewish culture, which is what this story has always been about. And so it's here that we finally come to something of an answer of the question that we've been posing for a few weeks now. Who are the Pharisees? Well, it's in the midst of this cultural crisis that they find themselves in. We've got our land back, but it's not really our land because, it's still very much surrounded by the Greeks. At the same time, it's ruled by a Jew, but the Jew's kind of doing what everybody else is doing. He's the king, he's the high priest, he's not actually playing by the rules as we understand them. And more importantly, he's very much a Greek. He's still not changing the cultural landscape to bring it back to the way that it should be, which is to be Jewish. So maybe we need to take it into our own hands. Culturally, maybe we need to take the matters into our own hand. Maybe we've got to stop waiting for our leaders to do it. Maybe we've got to stop waiting for the king to be the king and be the king as they've always meant to be, which is to lead us into this, back into Judaism. Maybe we've got to stop waiting for him. Maybe that whole institution is a total failure. Maybe that's the problem. Maybe we just need to stop looking to those guys for our leadership, and maybe we just need to do it ourselves. And so it's in this context, in this sort of Hellenistic context, and in this context where Hellenization is still being enforced on the people by their leaders, that we find emerging some political and religious pressure groups. People who are going, we're just going to do this ourselves. We're not going to be led by you. We're going to just take care of ourselves and look after ourselves in this way. And so it's in this context that we find the emergence of particularly the Pharisees. Now we find other groups, the Sadducees, we also find the Essenes. And we're going to go into a bit more detail next week about who these guys are. But it's in this context of severe Hellenization that we find a response. And what the Pharisees are, certainly to begin with, and really continue to be throughout the course of their existence, is a cultural and political pressure group. They are, what their job is to say to the people, this is what it should look like. Don't look to the king, don't look to these idiots over here and all of the stupidity and blasphemy and all the things that those guys are engaged in. Look at us. This is what Judaism looks like. And even if you don't, we're going to do it anyway, right? If you want to know what it looks like, come and look at us. If you don't, that's fine. That's your problem. You'll go to Shale, whatever, right? But we're going to do it this way. We're going to do it properly. If for no other reason that when God does return, when God actually does come back to restore things as they should be, he's going to find at least some of us that are still being faithful to what it means to be the people of God. All of these other people can be condemned, whatever, that's fine. That's their problem. But he's going to find some people who are faithful, and that's going to be us. So it's in that context, again, that we find the Pharisees, we find all of these groups start to emerge that we meet later on in the New Testament, and especially why we find these guys to be so influential, so powerful culturally certainly within Jerusalem and within that world. But again, as I say, we're going to pick up that in greater detail next week. We'll spend some time going into who these different groups are and how that sort of feeds into our story of the Gospels. But otherwise, that's all for this week. I hope that's been helpful, and I look forward to seeing you next week. All the best.